Hello everyone, and welcome to this video tutorial from BlenderCookie.com. My name is Jonathan Williamson, and today I'm going to give you a full introduction to texturing in cycles. Now, when I say texturing in cycles, I don't actually mean creating the textures, but simply how to go in and set up all the shaders and the textures within your scene or on your models to make use of things like diffuse maps, spec maps, bump maps, etc. Because I know there's been a lot of confusion with the switch or kind of transition to cycles on how you set these things up in Blender. In the Blender internal engine, it was pretty simple. You basically just enabled it as either a spec map or bump map or anything like that. But with the move towards a more realistic system and a node-based system, this is not quite as clear-cut as it used to be, but it's actually still pretty simple once you get the hang of it. So, what I have here is I have basically 5 different texture samples that we're going to look at creating. And we'll kind of look at some of the workflow things to go along with creating these. And I have prepared in advance a bump and spec map along with a color map for each one of these so that we don't need to worry about creating those in the meantime. There's a lot of other tutorials out there on how to create the actual textures. These are all from cgtextures.com, so they're freely available to any of you. And you can also find them if you want the spec and bump maps that go along with each of these. If you are a citizen member or if you sign up to be a citizen member, you can just simply download the source files and have all the textures ready to go. So, as you can see, we have a kind of a dirt and soil shader, a plastic shader, a concrete, a metal, and a brick. Now, each one of these are fairly simple, but are all kind of comprised of the same thing with a few variations. Each one has a bump map, a spec map, and a color map. So let's go ahead and look at an example of one of these and kind of see how it's built. So first of all, in cycles, if you're not already aware, there's basically 3 different display modes for cycles in the viewport. You have either solid mode, which is just solid gray, or else the display color for each one of the textures. Or you have material mode, which will actually show all of the objects with their UV mapped textures, just like texture display mode in Blender Internal. And then, of course, there's actually rendered view where you actually render them in the viewport. So let's take a look at, we'll start with just left to right with the soil texture. So the soil texture, and by the way, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of how these are set up, and then we'll look at actually how to create these. So with the soil texture, and this is pretty similar for each one of these, we have this node network that makes up our complete shader. So we have a spec map here, a color map, and a bump map. And then we have a couple other nodes that's basically telling Blender how to mix all of these together and what to do with them to then give us the final output. For those of you that are not a big fan of nodes, you can see the same thing via the material properties panel where we have all the different information here. Now, this is not nearly as clear and easy to follow, but you can still do everything from here. So for each one of these, they have this same node setup with a few variations for each one. For the plastic, you can see we've added a couple other nodes with a Fresnel or a Fresnel and a mapping node. With the concrete, it's basically the same thing as the plastic. The metal is roughly the same thing, and the brick is roughly the same thing again. So let's go ahead and look at how to create each one of these. So I have another blend file here called the start.blend, and we're going to just work directly from this. So if you are a citizen member and you've downloaded the source files and want to follow along, this is the blend file you want to start with, or if you want to compare with the final results, check out the finish.blend. And just since I'm working on this during the tutorial, I'm going to go ahead and save one more called working that I'm not going to include with the source files, but this way I don't overwrite anything that you guys want to take a look at. So let's start on the left with soil. So with the soil sphere selected, let's just go over here to the material properties, and we're going to add a new material. This material we'll go ahead and call soil. And before we continue setting up the textures, let's go ahead and take a quick look at the environment. So the environment is nothing more than a ground plane with a glossy shader, which is with a gray color and a roughness of 0.7, very, very basic. And then the lighting that we're going to do is we're going to do just one thing, and that is to set up an HDR environment or an HDRI probe. And an HDRI probe is basically a 360-degree image that allows us to light our scene based on a real-world environment. Or not necessarily a real-world environment, but oftentimes. The way that we do this is we just go to the material or the world properties. Underneath, the default should be surface set to background. If it's not, or perhaps if you have a node system, you can just simply add a new one, click either use nodes if it's not already enabled, and then set the surface to background. And then for the color, we want this color to be influenced by the HDR probe that we're going to input, or the HDR image. And so we're going to just click on this little button here, which allows us to basically specify an input for this color. So if we click the little button, we can say input an environment texture. And while I'm doing this, be sure to watch the node editor up here, because this will actually show you what's going on. Although right now it's actually set to display the nodes for the objects. So if we switch over to the world view, we can see that we have a background node and a world output. So the background is basically this, and then these two entries are the values for that background, namely the color and the strength. So you can see that these represent each other. And as we click this button to bring in an environment texture, you'll see it adds a new node right here directly connected to the color spot, so that we can then go ahead and click open. And in this case, underneath the textures folder that's included, I'm going to, unfortunately with the HDRI, we can't actually include this with the source files, simply because it's not licensed as such, and so we actually can't do anything with that, unfortunately. But there's lots of places that you can go get your own, and let me just navigate to the one that I want real quick. Here we go. I'm going to go ahead and use this one. But there's lots of places you can download your own. You can buy your own from 3docean.net, which is a great marketplace with a lot of 3D assets and textures and such. Really, really good. But unfortunately, we can't redistribute it with the source files. But once we set that, we can leave everything else as default. The vector basically refers to the way that it's mapped around the scene, and then the strength is, of course, the amount of light that it gives off. So if we real quick just switch into rendered view in the viewport, you'll see it's loading the HDR, and this will take just a moment because it's a really high-res HDR, so it takes a little bit longer to load. But then as soon as it starts going, we can see this HDR in the background. We can see that it's illuminating our scene, and if we were to rotate around the 3D view, you see right now it's just changing colors, and that's kind of weird. And this is because I'm actually in orthographic mode, but if I hit numpad 5 to switch into perspective mode, then it immediately shows in the actual 3D view. So this is the full 360-degree image. Really, really cool, and works great for lighting a scene. So going back to camera view here, let's go ahead and look at this, and let's say I just want to boost up the intensity just a little bit. Right now it's a little dark, so I'm just going to set the intensity to, say, 5. And that looks pretty good. Okay, so I'm just going to press Z to leave render view, and we'll just switch back into material mode so that we can actually see our materials as we're setting them up. So going back to the soil now that we have an environment render, and you notice I'm not using any lights in the scene outside the environment, just because I want a very generalized environment. I'm letting the HDR do the work for me. If this were an actual scene, I would probably need to throw in some extra lights as well, but I'm not going to worry about that for the time being. Oh, one little setting that you can enable if you use an HDR probe is a sample as lamp. Sometimes that can help reduce the noise in the background or on the objects that are being lit by the background. And then the resolution here, you can see that the tooltip, basically it's the size of the importance map, where the importance map basically generates a grayscale version of the image and then tries to send more samples, 4 cycles, to the parts that require more light and such. So you get more a better noise-free image. Now that's not always a guarantee, but you can kind of tweak that if you want. All right, so back to the materials though. So we have our soil, and again, with this panel here, and the node view, they both do the exact same thing. It's simply a different way of achieving the same task. And really, it's personal preference. Personally, what I like to do is I like to use the material properties to set up the initial nodes, and then use the node view to kind of customize and fine-tune and such. So let's first, leaving this as default with just diffuse, let's go ahead and just input or change this color, because we want to influence the color by an image since we have a texture. So we're just going to click this and we're going to choose image texture. On the image texture, we can then just click open. You can see that if we switch this back over to objects, it's added an image texture node right here. If you wanted to add it from the node view, you would just hit Shift A, add in a texture, image texture, and then you could connect the dots. So then we're just going to click open, and under the textures, we're going to pull in the soil sand 168_9_S. So this is the name directly from CG Textures, and then you can see the bump and the spec versions that I've generated as well. So we'll first choose this one, and we're just going to click Open Image. As soon as we do that, you'll notice that it's automatically just mapped to the view. It's currently, the mapping type is set to vector, or excuse me, the vector is set to default, and the default is either nothing or the UV image, or the UV coordinates. If your model is UV unwrapped, which case these spheres are, then the default will work just fine. If it's not unwrapped, then you'll see something like, if we just say remove this UV map, you'll see something like this, where it basically grabs the average color in the image, but doesn't know how to map it. So you just need to add a UV map, and then you'll be good to go. Next, we have our basic diffuse, but what we would like to do is we would like to add in some glossiness, basically a spec map. And that way, the spec map will control the shininess. So it'll say, these areas are supposed to be bright or light, these areas are reflective, these areas are not, and help to show some variation in the surface rather than just getting this uniform colored look, because that doesn't look very good. So the way that we do this is we add in first a glossy shader, because a diffuse has no reflective properties, whereas a glossy shader does. So if we want reflections or highlights or anything like that, we need to first add a glossy shader. Well, you may be thinking, well, how do I do that? Because if I just change this over to a glossy shader, then I've lost my diffuse, because if I set this, it just changes this. It doesn't actually add a new one. Well, the way that you do this is a perfect example of where the node view is more intuitive then, because you could simply say Shift-A, add shader, and either glossy or diffuse, and then it would add in a new one that then you could start working with. But if you want to do it through here, the way that you do that is you change first the surface, set it to a mix shader, and then you can set shader 1 and shader 2. So shader 1 will be a diffuse, shader 2 will be a glossy, and for each one of these, I'm going to input the same image texture. So under the color, I'm going to choose image texture and choose the soil. This one, I'll also choose the image texture and choose the soil. But let's take a look at something now. Let's take a look at the node view and see what's happened. You can see we've got our mix shader, we've got a material output, and then we have a glossy and a diffuse, and then we have two separate image textures that are using the exact same texture. Well, this doesn't really make any sense, because we ought to use the exact same texture. We don't really have a way to specify that here, because this is basically just a dumbed down version on how to add nodes. What would be more effective and easier to manage is if we just select one of these, delete it, and then just input the same image texture by clicking and dragging on the yellow dot and input it to the other yellow dot. A general rule of thumb with most nodes is that the color of dot for the output should go into the same color of dot for the input. Now, that's not always the case, but in general it is. Yellow basically refers to RGB values. Purple is a vector, where basically think of things like UV coordinates, generated mapping, etc. And then gray is a value for things like bump maps, spec maps, etc. So this is a case where it's better to use the node editor than to use this one. All right, moving on. I'm just going to reorganize that like so. I now have a diffuse and a glossy, and if you adjust the mix here, you can actually see that changing in the viewport, where 0 is 100% diffuse, 1 is 100% glossy. And if we were to render this, set this to render, and we'll let that load for just a moment. And something I'm going to do, since I'm recording, I'm going to disable I'm on CPU rendering right now, so that's fine. I'm just going to leave it rendering the entire time while we're going. And you can see that looks just fine, okay? But it's all glossy, it doesn't look like soil. If we switch this all the way back to 0, you can see it starts to look like that. I'm going to shrink this a little bit just to minimize my rendering. There we are. Okay, and I'm just set it over to the GPU compute, so it's using my graphics card instead of the CPU, since the CPU card on here is not much to speak of, and that looks pretty good. Okay, So what I want to do now is I want to influence this mix shader with the spec map such that I can have some areas reflective, some areas not. So the way that we do this is we go ahead and add in another image texture. Or if you wanted to do it from here, what you would actually do is you would have to go down here to the glossy, underneath the roughness, you would input first a RGB to black and white, then, and you can see that's added an RGB to black and white here, just so that we're inputting a colored image to grayscale values. And this is a general rule of thumb when inputting any kind of spec or bump map. You want to do this. That way you ensure that you're getting grayscale values, not colored values. And then we can input the image texture here. It adds a new one. We'll click open. And underneath the textures folder, let's go ahead and grab soil underscore spec and put that in there. And then this will mix the two. Now right now you can see nothing's changed because this is still set to 0. So if we set this to, let's just set this to 1 so we can kind of see what's happened. And you can see that now this is much different than that, where this is just overall glossy, and then this has more like specific components that are glossy where the rocks are kind of poking out, etc. So what we can do then is go ahead and actually mix these two. But what might be better is rather than inputting this into the roughness value, let's input this to the mix value. And this way, if we grab these two nodes, move these up here, now this, or the spec map, is now influencing how these two are mixed together. If we flip these around, we can alternate the effects. So now basically the black parts are glossy, the white parts are diffuse, or vice versa. Now, if this isn't quite strong enough, you can always adjust it a little bit more. Maybe take down the glossy amount there so we get a little bit more, and that starts to look a little better. If you want to increase or decrease the amount of spec in here, you can toss in between the RGB and the mix shader, you can add in a math node. So again, this is a case where this then becomes very cumbersome, cluttered, and really hard to follow. But this is very clear. Image texture. This is our diffuse, which we could actually name in here in the properties panel. We could just simply call it color. Oops. Color. And you can see it renames the node. This then could be our spec. And if we wanted to control the amount of spec, we could just hit Shift A, add in a vector or converter, math, drop this right on top there, simply switch the mode over to multiply, and then we could increase this to say 2, and it would double the amount of spec based on, well, not necessarily, but it's going to double the values in here. So if this is already solid black and white, it's not necessarily going to work as well. But it basically doubles the values in here. So if you have something that's 25% gray, and I hope I don't make a fool of myself, then this should make it basically 50% gray. Or excuse me, it'll make it twice as bright. All right. If we want to one thing with bump maps and spec maps, you generally need to set the value, or you don't need to, but it's better to set the value over linear. You can see how that when I do that, this changes here, where before it looked like that. Now it looks like this. So this just ensures that we're using good grayscale values and such. All right, so that's the spec map, and works pretty well. And of course, the result that you get is also going to depend on the quality of your actual spec map. So, you want to adjust the spec map to be good for what you're doing rather than simply just assume that it's going to work well. But let's go ahead and look at the bump map now. So the bump map works by feeding in values into the displacement channel right here, or the displacement channel right here. If you want to do it from here, you simply click on this and input, again, first an RGB black and white value. This then gives us the option to choose an image texture right here. And then you're going to go ahead and open up that texture, and you're going to choose bump. And then we'll just pull these down to get out of the way. And you can immediately see that the bump is now working. Now, again, with the bump map, we want to be able to adjust the intensity. So let's just grab our math node up here, Shift D, pull it down. And this then allows us to adjust it by setting the value right here. We could say set the value to 1, and that would take it down. Or if you find that your bump is inverted, you could set this to say -1. But personally, I get better results if you find that your bump is inverted, which it's not at the moment. You could actually just go into add a color and invert node and drop that in between your image texture and your black and white, and that would then invert the values of your texture, giving you the reverse effect. Again, I want to set this to linear to give me more accurate results. You can see a subtle improvement there, and that looks a good deal better. Now, it doesn't look great with my spec map, but that's okay. We could probably improve it a bit as we go along. Maybe we'll first just set that back to 1. That actually looks a little bit better. We can adjust this obviously any way we want. Obviously, you can see that setting that to add does not work. So in general, we're going to use multiply to adjust the strength of our spec or our bump map. And if this is just a little too dull, you can always toss in, say, a second mix shader and mix in, say, another glossy shader, just an overall gloss, something like this, to then subtly adjust the amount of gloss there. And so this is actually probably, this looks a lot nicer than before, where I'm just adding in basically an overall amount of glossiness to this, where you can see whoops, got to reconnect that there, and then remove that. If I set this down to 0, I'm just going to get a glossy white with the bump in here. But if I take this up to, say, 0.9, I'm going to get my same diffuse map with just a little bit of extra gloss in it. So you can, of course, adjust that any way that you wish to get a little bit extra control. So to recap here, we first have our diffuse map right here. This diffuse map is feeding into a diffuse and a glossy, which of course we can adjust these values here, the roughness, any way that we want. These are then feeding into a mix shader that is being powered, or basically determined how it's mixing, by our spec map, which is, again, a spec map is just a black and white image where white represents the shiny areas, black represents the matte areas. And so then this is then feeding into the factor value, allowing us to control how that's mixed based on the black and white. And next we just inputted another glossy shader just to add a little bit more gloss overall. And then finally we've got our bump map down here, which we ought to name as bump, feeding into the RGB, to the multiply, and the material output. So that's a way that you can set up a full shader chain inside Cycles. Well, let's go ahead and look now at the second one. The second one that we have is the plastic. So I'm going to go ahead and do this time completely from the node view. So let's first just click new, add a new material, and we'll call this plastic. This plastic, again, I'm going to add in a image texture. This image texture is going to be my plastic right here, just like this. Connect that, and that all works great. But now I want to do the same thing with this here for my entire thing. And in fact, you know what? Let's do this a little easier. On the plastic, let's go ahead and delete all but the material output. So I'm going to delete the diffuse and the image texture. Just hit X to delete. And of course, I accidentally reset my render, so it's reloading my HDR. Let's select this, and let's look at how to reuse nodes. Since nodes can obviously be a little cumbersome to set up, it's really good if we can just reuse these whenever we want. Well, this is actually really easy to do. Simply select the nodes that you want to reuse, press Ctrl G. That will add it to a new group. This group, you could just, in this case, this is going to be our soil. Well, this then is a single node, which if we hit Tab, we can then edit the node or the group, and you can see that this is automatically added outputs here. So this would be, say, our bump, which we can then move down. This then is our maybe color, or we'll just do surface. Okay, so that way we can very easily see that this feeds into that, this feeds into that. Great, so there's all kinds of other things that we could do with this, but we're just going to leave that just like it is. Let's now select our plastic, and if we simply hit Shift A and go down to group, you can see it's automatically added soil to our groups. So we can just add that in, hit Tab, and look at there, we've got all of our same nodes. And these groups are now linked, where if we looked up here, we can see that the soil group has two users. So my plastic shaders, my plastic materials using it, and my soil materials using it. Well, if I now just pull in, I can hit Tab, leave that, pull in the surface, pull in the bump, and lo and behold, I have a complete material just like that. Well, if I want to adjust this to be my plastic material. Let's just hit the 2 to make a new user, so it duplicates the group. We'll call this plastic. So now if you hit Shift A, add group, you can see we have plastic and soil. And now I can adjust this any way that I want. Well, the first step would be to load in the correct textures. So here's my plastic speck. Here is my plastic color. And here is my plastic bump. Now, it looks to me like I loaded in the wrong spec there. I want plastic underscore spec. There we go. Much better. And immediately it starts to look a little bit like plastic. But one of the things about plastic that we need to remember is that plastic has basically white highlights, where one of the key things in getting metal to render realistically and render well is that metal has colored reflections based on the actual surface color of the metal itself. So if you have, a rusty red or even just a red metal, all the reflections in that red metal are going to look subtly like or subtly red. And even just specular highlights are going to have a slight color tint to them. Plastic is not quite as much like that. And, most of the reflections are still a little bit colored based on the actual colored surface, but specular highlights in particular tend to show up much more white than usual. Well, if we just look at the specular amount on here, you can see it doesn't look nearly as white so much as it does blue. Well, one of the ways that we can mix this real easily is we can set this mix shader here to work a little bit more effectively, or in fact, actually, we're going to tone this down a little bit. We're going to get rid of these 2 nodes. So I'm going to select the 2 and hit Control X, or I can actually just hit X. Control X allows you to delete a node without breaking the link between them. So basically just removes it from the link. But in this case, it didn't work because of the multiple nodes. So if I just re-add that there, what I want to happen is I want this glossy to affect my reflections and the diffuse to set the color. So if this is just going to be white reflections, I'm just going to hold down Control, left click and drag across that, and that will give me a white gloss. But I don't want these to be mixed specifically by the spec here. The way that I'm going to do this instead is I'm going to remove this as well. I'm going to move the spec map down to the glossy, so the only specific parts of it are glossy, like that, rather than determining how it's mixed. And then I'm going to mix these 2, reconnecting that there, based on a Fresnel. So if I add an input, choose Fresnel, move this over, and then connect this, it's going to mix the 2 based on this index of refraction here. So it allows us almost to add like a coating to the surface. So if I just increase the Fresnel there, that will increase the index of refraction of that addition. So as we kind of rotate around here, if we go in here and let's just select this guy. Oops, let me enable rotate around selection. There we go. And now if I rotate around here, you can see we get much more white reflections than we previously did. And again, this is just set to influence the roughness. We could probably go ahead and boost this a little bit more. If we were to just take this out and then mix these 2, let's see. Yeah, the higher you take the index of refraction, the more mixing you're going to get. So you could take this kind of wherever you want, but generally something under 5 is probably where you're going to want to sit. But again, you can adjust that any way that you want. I'm going to just boost that back in there, and that starts to look fairly good. Now, of course, it's also going to have an impact based on your environment. So if your environment, let's say the sun in your environment is not in the good position, so you can see like our sun is kind of over here, where really I might like it to be, say, over here. Well, one of the ways that you can do that is in the world, we want to set the vector to be mapping, and then the mapping will allow us to adjust the rotation of the environment, and then we're going to set the vector for the mapping to be generated. This will just allow it to actually to map again correctly. So we just set mapping and then generated, and then you can adjust the Z rotation right here to then just spin that around. So if we set this to say 60, you can see that's put the sun basically right behind it, right behind our camera view, and give us some slightly better glossy reflections and such. Of course, you can see right now the bump on this is really, really strong. So on this, we could probably say take the bump down to maybe 0.25. That gets a lot less strong. We get a little bit better reflections there because the bump kind of can sometimes overwhelm your specular highlights, and that looks pretty good then. Cool. So this then gives us a nice plastic shader. Well, I'm not going to go through each and every one of these because they're all pretty much the same, but let's just jump right to the end and let's look at the bricks. Since the brick is going to have the most pronounced bump map on it, let's just zoom right over here and select the brick. You can see it's right here. Let's just click New, and we're going to name this Brick, and I'm going to go ahead and we're going to do this one completely from scratch this time. We're not going to use the group. The reason being is I want to show you exactly how to build this up completely from scratch in the node view rather than starting with something we already had. So let's first just hit Shift A, and we're going to add a shader, or excuse me, a texture, an image texture, because we've got our diffuse, but we need to color that diffuse. So we'll click Open. We're going to go to Textures, and we can see brick, brown. Here's our color. We'll connect the dots like that, yellow to yellow, and immediately we have a brick. Let's now go ahead and add in we're going to duplicate this image texture. We're going to set it to linear, and this then is going to be our bump map. So we'll go to Textures, and we'll choose Bump. And if we just feed this right in here, you can immediately see that it starts to work. So you can use a color node right into or a color socket right to a value socket, but it's not necessarily recommended. So I'm going to go ahead and use a converter, RGB to black and white, drop that right on top there. And if we mute this, you can see the difference. And in this case, there really is very little difference, partially because this actual image texture is already comprised of strictly grayscale values. Now, it's not actually a grayscale image based on the mode, but it is strictly grayscale values. And so this is not necessarily going to have much of an effect. But if you were to say, pull this one in, you can see what's happening. So we get a very interesting bump map. If I then mute that, well, actually it looks pretty much the same in this case, but regardless, there will be times where adding in the RGB to black and white will give you a much more accurate result or much more closer to what you intended. Next, let's go and add in, again, the math node. So we go to Shift A, Converter, Math, drop that right on there, and then switch this over to Multiply, and then this allows us to adjust it. So if we set this to 0, we get no bump. Set it to 1, we get regular bump. Set it to, say, 4, we get very extreme bump. So, maybe setting it to, say, 1.5 in this case might be good, because maybe I made my bump map a little bit weak. Okay, that's all fine and dandy. Well, now let's go ahead and add in the gloss. So I'm going to hit Shift A, add in a shader, glossy, bring it up over here. And then let's just input the same glossy color, or the same color in here. And you'll notice I don't need to add the vector for the image map because by default it uses the UV coordinates as long as they exist. So here's my glossy, and if we just pull the green into the green, you can see what the glossy looks like by default. It looks really nasty and gross. But if I go ahead, pull this over, disconnect the volume. By the way, the volume doesn't actually do anything in the moment. This is for volumetric rendering, which currently is not supported by default in Cycles, but there is some development going on towards that, so we should have it in the near future. But if I now hit Shift A, add in a shader, I can get a mix shader, which allows me to then drop that on there, drop this, or connect these together, and then I can mix these two together. Whoops. So there I get an average result of these two. And that already actually looks better than just the diffuse or just the glossy, but I again want to control this mixing based on my spec map. So I'm going to duplicate my image. I'm going to load in my spec map, which is this one right here. And I'll go ahead and duplicate the RGB value here, pull that over, and connect the gray to the gray. And immediately you can see we start to get a much nicer result where the grout between the bricks doesn't have nearly as much spec, but the bricks themselves have a much higher spec. If I want to adjust this, I might just take the roughness value for my bricks up a bit, because since bricks are not very reflective, they just get a little bit. They're not completely dull like a diffuse shader, but they've got a little bit of reflectiveness. I might take the roughness value up here a good bit, and that starts to look fairly good. Cool. So that gives me my basic shader. But what if, maybe since this is a tileable brick texture, maybe I want my bricks to be much smaller or much larger. Well, I could just go to my image, tile it in Photoshop, scale it down, and make a smaller brick or a larger brick, but that's a pain. Since it's a tileable texture, let's do it all in Blender, such that we don't even have to worry about it. The way that we do this is we use the vector inputs here based on a mapping node. So if we hit Shift A, add in a vector and a mapping, we can then pull this over, and I'm just going to connect this dot here to each one of these, because I want each image to be scaled exactly the same. Because again, these all match, except that each of them are slightly different scale or slightly different color information for bump and spec, etc. You can see as soon as I've done that, I've lost my UV coordinates, because Cycles doesn't know what vector this is using. It's just using some, well, frankly, nothing. So what I need to do is I need to tell this then to use the UV node. So if we hit Shift A, we can add in a input and texture coordinate. Under the texture coordinate, we've got UV as an option. So I just pull that right in there, and immediately my bricks pop right back. Well, now, just like we could adjust the scale for textures in the Blender internal engine, we can do this right inside Cycles. So if I just set the scale here to say 2, 2, and 2, that will tell Cycles to repeat this tileable texture twice within the UV space. Or if I set it to say 0.5, 0.5, 0.5, I get much larger bricks, which, this texture is not very high resolution, and so it looks really, really nasty. But you get the point. So again, you can adjust the scale very, very easily then, just like that. You can also set the rotation. So you can see as I spin the Z, that rotates that around the Y-axis, around the X-axis. These within 2D space, these can act a bit weird, but they're there if you want them. You can also, of course, shift it left or right, or up and down, or around the Z-axis, which shifting in 3D space or 2D space with the Z-axis, I don't actually know what that does. But there you have it. So that's how you use the mapping node to adjust your texture size and such. So there's 3 separate texturing examples. If you open up the finish.blend, which let me just open it now. So here's my finish. And real quick, I'm going to set my over to GPU rendering. And if we now render this, we can see that we've got, as soon as my HDR loads, we have several different textures in here. We've got the brick, the concrete, the ground plane, etc. On the plastic here looks a little bit better than the one during the actual tutorial, but you can go ahead and break it down to kind of see what it's done here, where again, I'm using a spec map, input it into a white glossy, to then mix with the color diffuse based on the Fresnel value. I'm multiplying my bump map here to be nice and clean. Get a nice good result. Same thing with the soil. It's simply a colored spec, colored diffuse mixed together. This time the mix here is just mixing them generically, so it's just mixing the two until I get a nice equal result. Same thing, the metal, same thing basically. I have a colored spec, which the spec I didn't really like the way that I'd done it. I felt that the way that I'd made it in Photoshop was inverted, so I simply inverted the color so that my the opposite areas were reflective rather than the previous ones. Then I'm using the multiply node again to tone down the strength of it, inputting that into my glossy shader so that only those parts that are white in this result are glossy. And then again, mixing those two together with just a general mixed node. And then, of course, using the same exact bump map. So all of these are done pretty much the same way, with just some subtle variations between them to then give us the nice final result. So even though texturing in Cycles may seem very cumbersome or scary or anything like that, it's really pretty easy. Again, you can use either the material properties here, or you can use the node view. And again, like I said in the beginning, I personally like to use the material properties to set up my initial ones, maybe to quickly set a diffuse or a glossy or maybe a mix, and then I use the node view for fine tuning and things like that. And of course, make good use of your groups to make reusable materials, because also these groups even though I don't have any in this, but if I had if I were to grab this one, which is my brick, and generally you don't put the material output in the group, by the way, because that you have to have that in each individual one. But if I select this, hit group, name this group to be brick, I can then link and append this group into any other blend file and reuse that any way that I want. So very, very valuable. If you just hit Alt-G, you can ungroup it, or Control-G to group it. If you have a few of these that are grouped and you want to add these to the group, simply select them, select the group, Control-Shift-G, or, oh, actually you can't add these to a group. Let's see, nodes, group. I'm not sure if you can add any to a current group. I think to add to a group, you need to be in the group, and then if you add in a node from there, it will automatically add it to the group, but it's not possible to add a currently existing node into a currently existing group. So that's pretty much it, and it looks like I may, oh, nope. I thought I had crashed Blender for a moment, but that's pretty much it. Hope that you found this helpful, and again, I recommend you download the source files, check out each individual texture. If you have any trouble following along, that ought to make it a lot easier for you. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks again, and hope you enjoyed.